Hi everyone, thank you for coming. It's quite strange for me being back here. Sheffield was my home city, but I haven't been here for about 20 years, so it's nice to be back. So, happiness for daily life, approaches to a public realm. I'm just going to whiz through about 5 projects that I've been involved with. I'll go at speed and there'll be plenty of time at the end to ask any questions. I've been working in this area for about 30 years, so I've done quite a lot of projects. So the kind of work I do, public interventions, exhibitions, policy, events, products, research and publications. I work for a wide variety of clients, people like the British Council, the Mayor's Office in London, cultural institutions, V&A, V&A East, Wellcome, also for developers, people like Argent King's Cross, so a wide range of clients. I operate in the cultural and public realm, and the scope of my work goes from mapping to concept to actualisation, and I can get involved at different points of that process. One of the principles of the way I work is around research. My work's always based on research, and I think of research as an active tool. So this can be anything from, this is a book I co-wrote with Lucy Musgrave, Design and Landscape for People, which is all about participative processes of making change happen in the public realm. And it was a worldwide survey, and we were looking at things like infrastructure and utility, citizenship, rural, identity, urban, and drawing lessons from that. This is a project I did for Carsten Holler and the Tate Gallery, Pleasure, Planning and the Public Realm. Carsten Holler is the artist you will know does those giant slides. When he did the slides at the Tate, he really wanted to have slides as a form of transportation in the public realm. So he commissioned us to produce a feasibility study, which was a serious feasibility study around the possibility of slides being used as a form of transportation. So we looked at the planning context. We did a vocabulary of slides. It was really interesting because there's no mention of pleasure within planning. So sometimes they will talk about enjoyment, but there was no mention of pleasure that we could attach this to. So we looked at the context and how they could be justified. We did the vocabulary of slides, and then we took a particular site, Stratford, and did a study with some engineers around the possibilities and problems around that. And sadly, in a sort of damning indictment of our time, Carsten now has done a slide, but it's on the Anish Kapoor sculpture in the Olympic Park, rather than as a proper form of transportation. You have to pay £25, I believe, to go on it. Mapping. I'm interested in mapping and mapping as an intervention. This was a project in Lisbon. The British Council invited me to curate their design pavilion. I should have said at the beginning, I work across art, design, architecture and planning. So this was an invitation from the British Council. So rather than doing a normal pavilion, we did 6 commissions in the public realm using and showcasing local resources, because the theme of the biennial that year was it was called Timeless, and the idea was that time and resources were running out, and I thought that was a bit doomy, so took a more positive view of that subject. So the mapping was, so this is Fabian Capello, mapped sites of cultural production and artisanship in this area, Odivelas, which is a suburb of Lisbon that the Biennale people very rarely would have attended. This is an artist, Linda Brothwell, who some of you may know. She teaches here. She is a jeweller who uses jewellery as a practice of repair. So here you can see she repaired 6 benches in the city of Lisbon, putting in new slats and making these little designs using, when she does these repairs, she learns the techniques of that location. So here she learned marquetry. I think part of what I'm motivated by is the idea of small pleasure and gifts that you can make to people in their experience of the public realm. So this one in particular, Linda produced for this man. He was a homeless man, but he came here every day to have his lunch. So she made this bench for him. This is an artist called, a designer called Anthony Burrell. His idea of local resources was more about the phrases and the kind of common law that existed in Lisbon. So he overheard a phrase and he used that for his intervention. It was, do not say all you think about all you say. And then this was by a group called Public Works. This idea of the world's running out of resources, they looked at the Biennale itself and used the waste product of the Biennale to make stools which they gave away to the public. This is the Happiness for Daily Life Cafe in Korea in 2010. This is the idea of a social public realm. So this was another invitation from the British Council. Korea has this incredible tradition of craft and an amazingly high skill of traditional crafts and an amazing tradition of new technologies, but the two don't meet. And so Korea was interested in doing a project that would bring together contemporary design and craft techniques, and it was also around a public realm initiative that the British Council were doing. So this building here, this is actually after it's been slightly spruced up. This was the town hall at the time of the Japanese occupation, so it wasn't a building that people wanted to go in. This project came about accidentally because we were calling an exhibition idea a cafe, and in Korea they'd taken that seriously, so we thought, oh, okay, then we'll just build a cafe. This was the space beforehand. I worked with an artist called Michel Marriott, a designer called Michel Marriott. He did this amazing job. He stripped back the space. He made this kind of single expression in the middle of a table. Each of the designers this place was in a city that had the University of Traditional Crafts. So each of the designers went and worked with the craftspeople in order to make the local craftspeople in order to make their piece, and the students. So here is the top of the table. Each of students Michael worked with made their own slat. This is the cafe in operation. The light covering the silk was done by Anthony Burrell. He worked with local students making these designs, these roundels. It was inspired by the craft traditions locally and a mix of the graphics in Korea. So this was the identity. This played through, externally. We had cups made. We did external seating, and then the cafe operated it was supposed to be open for 3 months, but they kept it running for a year. And the students from the university would come into town, which historically they hadn't done, and it was by a market. And so there was a lot of mixing of different populations happened in that cafe. Programming the public realm. An active public realm, I think, benefits from programming. So I'm just going to look at a couple of projects where I've dealt with programming in different ways. This is King's Cross Central. We produce the public realm play and art strategies for King's Cross Central. This is how it was at the point where we got involved. This is the Allies and Morrison Master Plan. This is the Townsend landscape strategy. So we did the 3 strategies: play strategy, art strategy and public realm strategy, and we were working there for 5 years, and it's really interesting to see, that's like 10 years ago now, so it's really interesting to see how that policy has now manifested itself. Again, it was all based on ideas around understanding the area, so we did a wider area survey, a Nolly plan looking at public realm in the area. But also, as a curator, my work is always held by a concept. So in King's Cross, the concept was a contemporary urban pleasure garden. So it was about this sort of the overlay of a fine green layer over the decayed industry, a history of sort of licit and illicit pleasure. You know, I had many a night going to the nightclubs of Bagley's and other experiences in King's Cross. So this notion of a contemporary urban pleasure garden was what was at the heart of all our strategies. The principles of that were to achieve a uniquely pleasurable experience of the public realm, to use play and art to define the legibility of the whole site, to consider play as spontaneous behaviour, non-age specific, and to emphasise a sense of place. And as I say, we were pre-planning and planning, and then we left, and it's been really interesting to see how that's played out over the years since then. And I think it is a new kind of programmed public space. Welcome Midsummer Picnic is a different kind of programming. The Wellcome Trust are on the Euston Road. They're an enormously wealthy medical foundation, and they have this incredible collection and museum in there, but they didn't have any relationship with their surrounding communities of Somerstown. So we came up with the idea of that we were engaged to look at their local engagement. We came up with the idea of Midsummer Picnics. So each year on Midsummer, the closest Saturday to Midsummer's Day, we would hold a picnic in Somerstown, working with Time Bank, who are a local volunteer charity, and the theme was all about healthy living, which is the Wellcome Trust mission. Worked with artists, Juno projects, came up with this concept of stalls and planting. So there was work prior to the picnic, vegetable heads, local women did pickling of vegetables. The Wellcome Trust had a presence on the site. No money changed hands as part of the Midsummer Picnic, so it was all a process of exchange between locals and the Wellcome Trust, and that made a different kind of relationship between the institution and the local people. It was enormously successful, it was great fun, it was all free, as I said. We programmed it for 2 years, but then the local community took it over and ran it for the following 4 years. So, life's a picnic. And then my last project I'm going to talk about is a current project, Mansions of the Future. This is based in Lincoln, and at the heart of this is the notion of the public and the cultural realm as a realm of discourse. So, this is the building. It's Mansions for the Future is an Ambitions for Excellence funded project. When we were invited to come up with an idea of what the Ambitions for Excellence funded project should be, Lincoln is a very fragmented place. It's got a steep hill called Steep Hill with a cathedral on the top of it, which is enormous, which is where all the power and wealth still is at the top of Steep Hill. The poverty and the disengagement is still on the flatlands at the bottom of the hill, and the university, which is on the old industrial area, kind of is moving into the city. So it's 3 territories that are very territorial. So I felt it was important that we should establish a neutral space, and this is at the pivot point of those 3 territories. And the idea of having a building rather than a series of art commissions was inspired by precursors such as Janne van Heeswijk's Blue House, in Rotterdam, a housing association for the mind, or Food in 1970s New York, kind of Gordon Matter Clark run artist cafe. We found this space opposite the train station. The Lincoln, fortuitously, it turned out that Lincoln Co-op owned it and gave it to us for 3 years. So they've gifted it to us for 3 years. And we have the whole of that space. The top floor on the right is artist studios, and I'm going to take you through the other spaces. So we commissioned Catherine Bohm to do the design for the building and for the first year of programming. She was our inaugural artist. So you enter the room with this yellow floor and a map of Lincoln's culture, show us where you are. So it's an invitation to people to mark their culture. To the right of that is a reading room, and each artist who exhibits gives us 6 rooms that go into 6 books that go into the reading room, and then they go back into the libraries of Lincoln. You go up the yellow brick road. This is a ramp. We wanted the building to be accessible, but it's a very small space. It's really tight. So to have made a ramp would have been really ugly, other than Catherine's brilliant idea of turning the whole space into a ramp. So this is our yellow brick road. This is the meeting room. People can come in and use the space. It's open for people to come and have events, meetings, workshops. So it's a sort of overlaying of local cultures coming in and taking the building over. All of the furniture comes from processes of co-production. This is the kitchen. This is our larder, where it's like an alternative document or reading of the production of Lincoln. This is the resource room, where we're making stuff to go into the space. Resource room again. And then this is the commons room, where everything comes together, and this is where most of the public programming happens. And there's something, I'm probably slightly about to go over time, but I'm just going to read this because I think there's something truly incredible about what Catherine's done, which at first reading you think, oh yeah, it's all totally straightforward, the different kinds of space that she's allocated in this cultural centre. But then the more you use it, the more you see how welcoming it is and how much people love it. And I think, and she's not said this, but this is my reading of it, that there's the reading room, which is the thought and knowledge and the mind, the meeting room, which is conversations and debate and the head, the resource room, the place of making and hands, the larder, nutrition and the body, economy as glue, that's the central hall, that's about financial systems and external infrastructures, and then the commons room, where we can all come together to create a common culture, the whole. So there's something really beautifully holistic about this. We have seasonal events. This is Catherine doing the harvest on the commons, a summer school series of workshops, monthly and weekly workshops. We've got a philosopher in residence, Aisha Delanarole. She's our director of fundamental questions. This is a philosophical inquiry she did on the nature of what is radical. We've started putting exhibitions in the space, but they're all linked to programmes of debate and activity, mixing different communities together, and that's starting to happen. This is the artist and the Lincolnshire Loves Plants wildlife organisation, mixing audiences, seed sovereignty and seed diversity. Angela Chan, the colonial history of climate change. We work with ideas of surveying, young people. Before we started, we we wanted to do something that was really welcoming to the people of Lincoln, so we took over Sinsel Salon, which is a hairdressing salon just round the corner. A young filmmaker, Bonnie Wright, had made a film about set in a hairdressing salon called Medusa's Ankles, and it's about women of a certain age losing their visibility. So we showed the world premiere of this film in Sinsel Salon, and you had to book to go and have an individual showing, an experience of seeing the film. This is a work by Bridget Smith, which also opened, because we're doing a series of commissions as well as the stuff in the space. Bridget has been inspired by Swedenborg and notions of what thoughts we need and principles we need in order to live a rich and full life. And she invited a whole series of artists, writers, philosophers to contribute a phrase for how we should live. Keep it complex, make it clear is Catherine Bohm's. It's all about geography. Bikes are excellent. And these are on billboards and poster sites around the city. Mansions of the Future was named after a project that happened by another artist called Ruth Ewan in 2015. Ruth Ewan did a project called The Difference, where Lincoln holds the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. It was the anniversary of the Magna Carta. She worked with young people to ask them to come up with their series of rules for living. Things they said were, so it was 9-year-old children, they come up with a new series of rules. We may live twice. As we see the moon, so we will also be able to go to the moon when it is our turn. A friend of mine will in time become my sister. And one of the children wrote, we will share the mansions of the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose as chair of Site Gallery, I need to officially welcome you and say thank you for coming and things like that. So it's really good that you could come here this evening. I was saying to Clare earlier on, actually, because most talks that I do are during the day, and they're for people that are paid to be there, and they're not always necessarily there voluntarily. And you're all here, I presume, voluntarily. So it creates a slightly different sense of responsibility. So there we go. We'll see how we flow. So I run a research and consultancy organisation, and very broadly we focus on people and places. But the kind of umbrella for all of that is around understanding culture and creativity. So in other words, we do a lot of policy-based and research-based work that positions culture and creativity to the heart of thinking, whether it be around urban planning, whether it be around economic policy, or this thing called cultural policy or cultural planning. And Claire's right, there is very little pleasure in planning often, and a lot of our work is around how to find inroads into the bigger strategic conversations about city making, which are driven by the accumulation of capital or about the coordination of infrastructure or around systems. We try to work with that to introduce some wider questions around culture and identity, and try to understand what drives people to be in a certain place, what attracts them to be in a certain place, and understand the role that culture and practice in relation to culture has in that place, and the way that plays out distinctively in different contexts. And therefore I'm not an artist, I'm not a curator. We very rarely commission any work. Instead we ask the question, I suppose, and we kind of dangle big strategic questions over places about who's it for, where's it going, how can it be more animated, how can this activity be more impactful, and how can we ensure that happens in a context that is not just about doing things to people, but increasingly about doing things with people. So research-based, participatory, driven by engagement, and increasingly adopting approaches that are co-created, and that embrace the messiness of placemaking and planning, as opposed to try to enforce simplicity and systems over a place. And it relates in a sense to this quote from James C. Scott. I think that there's an impulse in cities and wherever you go to simplify, to segment, to coordinate, to set up boundaries, to signpost, to make more navigable, but in doing so makes less visceral and less tangible and less meaningful. And that's, I think, is a balancing act that happens in city making and policy overall, is in terms of how you, on the one hand, attend to the distinctiveness of a place and embrace that, but on the other hand, deal with the systems that are required to make it more to enhance mobility, to enhance social and economic interactions. And this is all in the context of crisis, of urban crisis, of systems failure. And I think it's interesting to contextualise the work of Clare and other people who are mobilising creative practice, to think of that in the context of crisis, whether it be environmental, financial, social, or whatever. And there is a increasing sense of responsibility, I suppose, for artists or the arts generally to attend to the kind of crisis that we face, but also that creates a burden of representation, or it creates demands on the creative process. And it also, I suppose, means that it changes the terms of reference. So on the one hand, we have interventions that position creative practitioners in a process of growth and development. So the King's Cross example is one of those. Whereas in another context, it's about social cohesion, or how to connect neighbourhoods, or it could be issues-based in terms of how to build environmental awareness or intercultural literacy, or whatever it may be. So the kind of portfolio of demands placed on the role of the artist or the creative in an urban environment is increasing by day. Increasing as well as at a time when the literacy of planners, developers, city makers is increasing around the role and the power of the arts. So there are questions there around how we nurture an arts sector or an arts system that is capable of playing a responsible role across a broad range of systems or a great range of issues and drivers, and how we do so at the same time in a way that doesn't exploit the artist and also doesn't commodify the process in a way which exacts a kind of an unhelpful power of the kind of the planner or the markets on an artist to deliver outcomes which they perhaps weren't prepared to do or didn't consider as part of their job. So there is this kind of growing awareness of the role that arts and culture have in city making, and our role as a research and consultancy organisation is to try to articulate that and embed it within strategic plans. So for example, we develop a lot of cultural strategies for cities, or we do a lot of baseline research and mapping, and actually like Clare Action research, we use the research itself to be a participatory process to generate conversations which in turn reframe ideas around identity and place. But often the drivers are about these kinds of things. The kind of battle for distinctiveness that we have in our societies these days, partly self-mobilised in response to the kind of perceived homogenisation of cities. And of course, the arts can provide distinctive voices that can disrupt the narrative and perform as well as embed distinctiveness in place. The role of everyday creativity and mobilising participation, which goes right back to to education, but also transitions into everyday life. So the notion of the public and the notion of citizenship and the role that the arts can play in re-engaging people with their environments and their communities and the places in which they're in, including the development of new places and spaces. And then the role of the arts as disruptors, as being able to ask those questions, but also to engage in processes that reframe the terms of reference for what is in place or out of place, for what the economy looks like today and what it can be tomorrow, or for how you connect what would otherwise be disparate sensibilities or disparate identities in different contexts. And that works right to the very top, really, in terms of policy making and investment. So we recently did a small piece of work with a colleague of mine called Catherine Bunting around the role the Arts Council plays as a kind of funder and a partner and a champion for the role of arts in society. And our work looked at a place-based level across different cities. We looked at big core cities like Manchester. We looked at smaller cities like Norwich. We looked at London boroughs, like including Barking and Dagenham, and trying to articulate the kind of value proposition that the investment of the Arts Council was having on those different places. And we kind of abstracted it into these kinds of outcomes around the economy, around tourism, around talent development and retention, around developing distinctive places with strong identities, that sort of thing. But of course, this is very much a contested landscape, because the Arts Council itself is making strategic policy decisions in partnership with local authorities, with developers, etc., which are framed by a sense of strategic outcomes, which may not be the outcomes that the artist or the creative practitioner would have in mind as a core driver for their practice. So there's often a gap between the policy narrative and the investment narrative and the reality of creative activities on the ground, particularly for funded programs in a given context. Another project we worked on a couple of years ago was in the city of Bristol, where we led the process for a new cultural strategy for the city. And this is a similarly sized city to Sheffield, with a really strong and dynamic cultural and creative sector. But it's also a city that is very divided economically, socially. It's a city which struggles to find a kind of progressive contemporary identity built as it was on slavery. It's a place that is constantly in this kind of radical process of renegotiating its identity and struggling to work out who it's for and where it's going. The process that we undertook there was as participatory as we could make it. So we did, in that context, commission artists, and we did commission people working in a kind of community interventionist practices. We worked as well with kind of skillful visual scribes, and we worked with young people in terms of doing sort of citizen journalism, just to try to get different voices into the system than you would have through the classic consultation methodologies where you run workshops about how to develop and nurture the cultural sector, or the role of the education sector in supporting creative talent, or whatever it may be. So there was a lot of out of place or third space participatory consultation. And we came up with some very broad themes, which we thought signified the cultural ambition, and to an extent the growing trend in the city around being a more open and connected and intercultural place, a place that champions origination of ideas, and in some ways that's similar in Sheffield with a focus on making, and a city that fires the imagination and in a more inclusive way than it had historically. And this kind of plays on some of the strengths that the city has as well, and I was pleased that Clare mentioned play and performance as well is really key, and this is something that was seen as a real strength in Bristol. It's a city that obviously people know that Banksy's from Bristol, and it's a city where the fabric, the physical fabric and the social fabric of the city is something that keeps getting reimagined through the performance of creative practice, and a lot of that is through play. It's also a city that has championed these kinds of third spaces, such as the Pervasive Media Studio in the watershed in the city, which brings together scientists, technologists, artists, a whole range of different kinds of interdisciplinary practices, commissioning across boundaries to develop new types of work and to ask questions around the direction of the city in terms of its economy, in terms of its the civic journey that it's on. And it's the first time we've undertaken a piece of work where there were kind of feedback loops from the arts sector in the city that were beyond any kind of control of the cultural strategy process. So on this bridge in Stokes Croft, somebody quoted elements of a draft cultural strategy as a kind of provocation, but perhaps also as a validation of the kinds of themes that were being developed through that. And it comes back to something that is dear to us in the work that we do, which is around how you build conversations across boundaries. And I've listened to Clare there, a lot of the work that you seem to do seems to connect different communities of interest, different types of practice, to kind of ask questions around how do you reimagine a place or a space or a development. And I love this quote from Geoffrey Crossett because it kind of celebrates the interstitial or the third space or the thing that blends different ways of seeing and ways of working. And it kind of attends to sort of using metaphors around the ecosystem or around the kind of the web of interdependencies that are really important for a city to effectively function, as opposed to something that is system planned and where you create barriers by being overly instructive in that process. This is all well and good. So there's a lot of positive progressive work going on across the country which is connecting communities through artistic practice, which is reimagining the possibility of the city in new and distinctive ways, and is embracing play and performance and pleasure in ways that are genuinely positive and making significant change. But of course this is situated in the context, as I said earlier on, around cities in crisis and the kind of withdrawal of resources to be able to mobilise a lot of those activities. And as a consequence, the withdrawal of capacity to be able to do things which historically we would like to do. So there's kind of big questions, I think, around public space. Who owns public space? Where is the invisible hand of the commissioner in a lot of activities that happen? The kind of notion of private space as well, and I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of conversation around the extent to which King's Cross is a public space because it's privately owned, and there are questions around permission. There are issues obviously around surveillance, and I saw a quote recently where someone said you need the haystack to find the needle, and that's the kind of approach to mass surveillance and big data and the way that kind of manages and generates knowledge which can be used in different ways by monitoring public space and what happens in public space. And then there is that question around homogenisation, and that there is, I think, in some ways, an identity crisis around urban space in many of our cities these days, which feel very similar. And then there's that question around permission, so the designing out of certain kinds of activities. These are three very different bits of public space. I can't remember where the one at the top is, but that's clearly been designed to stop rough sleeping. This is, in the bottom left, is in Medellin in Colombia. These kind of tall lantern spikes, they look brilliant at night, but effectively this is designing out crime, because this is an area this is kind of on the front line of a lot of the kind of the different turf wars that were going on related to the drugs crisis. And this incredibly sanitized but very expensively prepared public space, which is really a private space, is in the middle of Kuwait City. And obviously most things that you could think of wouldn't be allowed there, as opposed to the things that would be allowed in that space. So when artists like Christoph Bodisko says that the best public spaces exist for both the privileged and the unwanted, I would challenge you to think of all the spaces that actually do enable those kinds of uses to coexist. I also think that there is this slightly dangerous arc of commodification of creative practice in public space, which is dangerous in generating a kind of exclusionary use of and a kind of a genericism as well of public space. So there's lots of frivolous and often engaging creative practice in different places, but actually there's a danger of it all feeling quite similar as well some of the time. I think it's probably a perpetual challenge for you, Clare. I don't know, I mean, and other artists, is around how you continue to make distinctive work and ensure that it has a distinctive and resonant voice. And how do we open up the process as well, so that the creative producers and those participating aren't just the hipsters, they are also coming from different walks of life. And so that creative practice as everyday life participatory processes are really key as well. And then how do you tell that story? And cities often commodify something that may be very rooted and embedded and inclusive, but they tell the story in ways that actually create a generic narrative around how creative that city is, as a way of trying to boost inward investment, attract talent, build visitor economy. So you can have something that's very rooted and open and progressive, but actually you might lose, as soon as the artist moves out, you lose the power of the story, and it might get managed in a way that's beyond what you were historically trying to deliver on. So we need to constantly rethink and criticise, be critical of the role of creativity in the urban fabric, the commissioning of artists for notional greater good. We need to constantly problematise who benefits, who's in the conversation, who's out of the conversation, who manages and owns the conversation and the narrative going forward. there's something really powerful about the way that public space has been reclaimed and by the kind of so-called hashtag activism stuff that kind of mobilizes people into public space very quickly to do disruptive things and often to protest. But there's an everyday creativity question here as well around how we can open up ownership of the public space and ownership of the narrative of public space. There's a constant need to contest, reformulate the relationships, and as soon as something becomes for a given community, how do we ensure that that doesn't become something that's against another community? There's something that I think is really important. The best public spaces do connect and do open up different types of ownership for different kinds of community, whether different times of different generations, different ethnicities, different walks of life. They're agile, they're accessible, they're legible, they're malleable, they're tangible, and yet they're very hard to achieve. And I think that the idea of space as a process is really important there, to be able to constantly reinvent it as opposed to say, this is done now, let's move on to the next bit of the city that is a problem that we need to somehow enhance, which is where the small acts are really important. The small acts in public space is notionally completed as opposed to small acts as a way of reimagining a public space that is then invested in and then is done notionally. So we've been doing lots of work conceptualizing this and some small bits of work commissioning stuff. Some of my favourite examples, we did some work as part of European Capital of Culture in a city called Guimarães in northern Portugal in 2012, which was a precursor in some ways to the Playable City stuff in Bristol, because we worked with Watershed to commission James Bridle in something which was around remapping the city, where it was kind of early days of being able to put drones up in the air and to kind of have a kind of more bespoke approach to how you map and understand the dynamics of the city. And there were lots of participatory workshops that brought together people from different walks of life to create the technology as well as to kind of remap the city. I really like this I can't even read it, the parastatic play, or to speak freely in Greek, by Zenobia Touloudi, which is effectively you can just keep reframing the sentences. It's like a street writing or something, and you can create your own words. It's a kind of mood board for that bit of public space, and it's really obvious and legible and inclusive. I think from Lincoln to Luton. Luton's interesting in some of the ideas that they've got for their UK city. They're doing a sort of trial UK City of Culture programme this year. The old town hall was destroyed in the peace riots after the First World War, when there was just a sense of being left behind and there was kind of widespread poverty, disaffection. And there's a kind of reclaiming of the notion of the town hall, which is a symbol of public space and should be for everybody. And they're using that now in a kind of in an imaginative way to program contemporary arts practice. There's big shiny examples which are really important, such as in Nantes, the Ile de Nantes project, which essentially was about giving an organisation the space to develop and grow. And in turn, Le Machine de Nantes created all sorts of incredible major outdoor arts interventions, including the elephant, which now roams around the Ile de Nantes every day, has become a symbol for the city, created and made in the city, which you couldn't make in a branding agency. And it's an experience, and it's free, and it somehow feels authentic and genuine to that place. I don't advocate this, but I think there's something in it, in that there's a lot of obsession at cultural policy level around building-based organisations, and I'm the chair of one, and I say they're vitally important in the whole ecosystem for a city. But I think festivals are equally important, and building the festival sector to be able to populate and reimagine and re-engage with the public space of a city is really, really important. And almost finally, this is about participatory governance. So when it comes to planning, planning should be, as we all know, not just the instructive top-down approach to planning. We need to somehow demand that our policymakers in this city and elsewhere open up the conversation about who owns this space, who's it for, and where's it going. Classic point is the space across the road from here, next to what is now the Student Union of Hallam University. That is a space ripe for reimagination, and this project, City Ideas, is tinkering with that. But there's an opportunity for a partnership between the city, Hallam, this organisation, and the arts of Sheffield to make that a real kind of test bed for the kind of the repurposing and constant repurposing of public space and understanding public space as process. I'll leave it at that because I've gone over time, I think. Have I? Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I'd like to kick off a question relating to Burrell Park, actually, which is essentially that it's a kind of non-space that doesn't really have any history and doesn't really have a neighbourhood. How do you imagine that that can be used in order to sort of bring communities to it and create a community based on space rather than building a space based on community? If that makes sense.
I think there are always communities. So I don't believe there isn't any community. However transient that might be. And I think that welcome Midsummer Picnic was really significant to the people who took part in it, and it created a lot of new relationships between the communities around that green, through the selection of the different kinds of and the curation of the different kinds of activities that were offered as part of the initial 2 picnics. So that seeded new relationships and activities and usage of the space that they then went on to deliver themselves. So I struggle to imagine that there are no communities, and I wanted a project at the V&A where we decided to map hobby crafters, and we just mapped all of these like strange obsessive knitters or enamelists, or and I think you can choose all different kinds of communities to map and engage with, and then that can catalyse occupation of a space, I would say. Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely a community. I mean, site's opposite it, and there's a community there, and obviously the university's there. I've got an example I didn't give, so this is the good thing about talking too long. This is a space in Guimarães, which I mentioned in northern Portugal. It's a very different space to the one opposite. These are old leather tanning pools that were used in way back. In this district's called Chorus, and it's right on the edge of the city centre. There is actually a residential community there, but it's very much bypassed and became problematic, and classic thing, drug use and other things. And we used it as a platform for dialogue, really, with existing communities, but also to bring the rest of the city into it, so that it became more relevant to them, because it was just off-centre, just as this one is. And we also kind of stuck by the idea that it's a process. So there's lots of kind of community building projects going on, and there was gardening projects going on, and during European Capital of Culture we settled it as a kind of music venue, but there were talks there, and it was a meanwhile idea, but now it's actually a permanent kind of mini urban park in the city, which is used still for performance and talks and stuff. And actually that kind of activity could be programmed there, and that what you haven't got here is a residential community of any great scale, so you can make a noise as well, which opens it up for all sorts of interesting ideas. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean that's true. We're sort of a lot of what we're doing is kind of small scale kind of interventions with different aspects of the communities that we've got along here, but in terms of having like a longer term impact, I guess there needs to be stakeholders who want to have upkeep of that space once this Ambition for Excellence project is expired. There is not necessarily money to support that kind of thing. That's the sort of who are the stakeholders who need to be in the ground to keep that going is my question.
I feel like you can identify those stakeholders over time, and in Mansions of the Future, the theme of the programme is around power and democracy, because Lincoln's got the Charter of the Forest and the Magna Carta, and our ambition is to create a kind of culturally empowered citizenry of Lincoln, so quite big ambitions. But we thought a lot about what power relationships are in the city and how to make a space where people all feel comfortable to come in, and where where people can start occupying it over time. And some people, it takes them longer than others to feel comfortable and to, raise their voices and to say they want to be part of it, and they might want to, do stuff. But we're finding that communities are coming in and taking over, and there's loads of events happening in the space, and volunteers are taking over different bits of it. But it's happened over time, and the invitation and the initial events are used to start identifying those stakeholders.
I'm interested in what you're talking about festivals being festivals rather than institutions playing a key role in the future of cities' cultural strategies. Alongside the backdrop of creeping privatisation of public spaces, I wonder if you just had any thoughts on how those two parallel strategies could possibly work.
It's really difficult, isn't it? It's much easier not to do them than to do them, and many a festival has got stuck in terms of licensing or the cost of policing, or the perceived questions around the kind of negative externalities of having lots of people in one place. I think that there are certain things that are functional, so how you build in the infrastructure to public space or pseudo-public space so that you can have outdoor events, and that comes down to the legibility, the topography, the wiring, the access to power and water and things like that. I think it comes down to really strong committed partnerships with the developers and with the businesses that would set to benefit from having a coordinated approach to building an events or festivals strategy in a city. So the kind of big shiny examples would be somewhere like God, what's it called? In Canada, French Canadian city beginning of N. Sorry, tired. Montreal, yeah. Quiz night. They've basically got a festival precinct, which seems a bit too instructive, but they've basically created a district in the city to be able to grandstand their festival economy. Or a kind of finer grained version would be South by Southwest in Austin, where it's kind of happened more organically, and they've had to develop and respond as they go, and they've used the buildings as well as the streets to significant effect. But it requires long-term strategic thinking. You can't just organically build a festival sector and then turn around and say, well, you can't develop and grow because we haven't got the systems in place for you to do that. It's about building literacy and partnership with a strategic process and some key horizons to work towards that aren't just about the festival sector working towards.
So you can almost build the public infrastructure for a festival on a permanent basis, but allow the free and frequent reprogramming of it.
Yes.
So it's almost about allowing for public spaces to be frequently reprogrammed under organic.
Yeah, and to make that a goal for that public space rather than as an afterthought. I think it's really key, and that saves money anyway, further down the road.
Can I ask a question about how you see yourself in terms of creating the need or identifying it? How proactive are you in this process?
I work in different ways, in that sometimes I'll be commissioned against a brief, and I quite like that. I like a problem, so then I'll respond to a given problem, but I could respond in different ways. Or other times I will have an idea, and the Midsummer Picnics was our idea that we pushed forward. Or sometimes I do initiate ideas that I then find a home for. Yeah. How about you?
I don't know. I mean, There's,
Are you always client-based, or do you sometimes have a piece of work and then you go out and find somebody to do it with?
We're mostly client-based, or relationship-based. So it's often about places that we already have relationships in or interested in working in, and we follow our nose a bit, and then sometimes that becomes a client-based transaction. I feel that what motivates me in any of these contexts is just trying to understand and get under the skin of a place. And I often, if it's client-based, the agenda might be around, for example, how do we nurture and grow our cultural industries sector? And what do you do or say when there isn't really much of a cultural industry sector? And actually there's a much longer term agenda here, which is about getting people to participate in their communities. So there's often a redrawing of the brief in the work that we do as much as possible. And there's always as well an issue around how you incentivize people to do something that they wouldn't historically encounter or necessarily be interested in doing. I think this is a real challenge for the arts and culture in general, in that I think this is what was really interesting in your examples, because actually you're kind of transcending the arts and culture, and it's about creativity and participation, because there is often a kind of default position, which is if you just increase the reach of the arts into people's communities, it makes it relevant to their lives. But that's not necessarily the case, because they might not necessarily be interested in that. So a lot of our work is actually trying to work out the touch points that are relevant to different communities, and then in turn you develop tactics, which in turn become strategies, which hopefully have a longer term goal, which might have economic ends, but they certainly are underpinned by people just more actively engaging in where they live. But obviously often clients are in more of a rush than that kind of agenda enables. So.
We have a question at the back here. Do you mind passing the mic?
I'm just interested in success. How do you define success as individuals and practitioners? And who's defining success in what ways in the projects that you do?
Do you want to start?
Oh, thanks. This is probably easy for you because you actually make things and things happen in public space. And often, for me, the gratification comes when you do go back to a place and see that actually the things that you research and planned and strategized are somehow being not enacted. It's not some sort of power thing, like they did what we told them. It's actually you collectively identified an opportunity, and they've continued to focus on that and energetically embrace the thing that you work together on. So, I think it's much easier to see that when you work with organisations than with municipalities. It's often easier as well to see the cause and effects of your work with an organisation than at a city level. So I mentioned a couple of times Watershed in Bristol because they're one of the organisations we just keep working with, and in different contexts, and we commission them and they sometimes commission us. So that there's a nice kind of creative, collaborative spirit to that, and that's because I like their principles, which is about being open. In the pervasive media studio, it's also one of the principles is that everyone should be interruptible, and that kind of stuff I think enables really interesting conversations that in turn generate ideas. And at that level in an organisation, you can see how that delivers outcomes. It's much harder to abstract that and scale it up at a city level. So that's why I like, that's why it's such a privilege to work with Site, because they're kind of brokers and connectors. In many ways, and I think that's really important in terms of just building a community in an urban context where that is much harder to retain.
I guess I have many different sort of multi-layered idea of how I determine success. From I suppose in terms of impact, probably King's Cross is the biggest job I've done, and that my idea about whether or not that's a success will change over time. But then the thing I'm most proud of is I tend to build interdisciplinary teams around me, and seeing what those people go on and do, for me is the that's how I judge my success, and looking at artists that I've commissioned and what, you know, at critical points, and I feel, you know, obviously there's a big emphasis on evaluation now from public bodies, and whilst I can see that's, you know, necessary and laudable, so often that doesn't actually touch what we all know is either the success or failure of a project, and the success often is something slightly more nebulous, but that you can just feel, you can see those moments of magic happening, and so yeah, I tend
Would you really get there? Because there's a massive time dimension here. You know, I can think back to the year 2000 when the whole fruit market was being cleared out as a fruit market. It's that development work that started there, contributes to the capital culture. It's still contributing, and on the wires today, brand new digital workspace being commissioned and being built. Now that's 20 years nearly since that kicked off. You've got to see the time dimension in terms of success as well.
Sort of following on from that, it's been fantastic to see so many of the inspiring projects. Could you tell us about a project that hasn't felt successful to you, and why? What were the learnings that you took from it?
I grew up in South Yorkshire, very politically motivated, and my natural partner or client or context in which I would work would be public sector. I went through quite a critical experience, well, I won't say who the client was, maybe 20 years ago, where we did a really incredible project that was really transformative in terms of what it could achieve, and actually all people wanted to do with it was go and show it at conferences. They didn't want to actually do anything with it. They just wanted to talk about it. So then went to work for Argent King's Cross, who just wanted to do stuff. And even though that wasn't my natural environment, it was so great to be somewhere where somebody wanted to, you know, action happened. And then had a number of experiences with developers who weren't of that sort of calibre of excellence, who probably just wanted to, you know, essentially art wash or public realm wash their schemes. I think that probably only happened twice, and then, you know, wised up to that. So I wouldn't necessarily identify anything as a failure. I would say more it's that, you know, you go through things, don't you, and then you learn from that and think, oh, no, I'll go and do it I'll try it in a different context, or I'll try it in a different way.
So looking for a film that's interested in social outcomes over, or maybe they were both interested.
I've actually always found that it. Just wondering how to say this. If people pay you, they're more likely to deliver what your advice is. If they are funding you to enable you to deliver it, they're not as invested in it happening. So you have to make sure yourself, you have to be driven yourself to make it happen. Can you say something about that?
Yeah.
How do you feel about who does and who doesn't implement your advice?
It's getting it's getting more difficult. Not it's not necessarily the answer to the question. It's getting harder to find invested people who are commissioning work, and I think it's partly because of the kind of austerity. So a lot of our clients are public sector, so the teams that are getting smaller and people are so rushed, and they're not able to invest their professional lives into the project that they're commissioning. There's always a moment when we don't know whether we should go for something or respond to an overture, because we're not sure whether they're really up for this or whether they're doing it because they feel they haven't got the capacity in-house, so they're outsourcing it, or somebody up above has said we need to have a cultural strategy because we haven't got one, it needs a refresh or something like that. The more soulless work tends to come where the distance between the commissioner and the ground is greatest. So that could be at a very abstract level around policy with governments, or it could be with these local enterprise partnership things that are across the country now, which are, a lot of them are commissioning cultural strategies because they feel they need to have a cultural strategy as part of their overall economic or industrial strategy. So they're going through the motions, some of them, sometimes not, but being able to read whether they are or not, the process of the brief being commissioned is really, really hard. The thing that keeps us sane actually is the work we're doing internationally, because and more than half our work is outside of this country, and I think that's partly because where we've been working internationally, there's a real kind of hunger often, and they're really invested because they've tried to get you to come out of your country to get their country to work with you to develop new thinking. So there's a sense of need, whereas sometimes in this country, and maybe I'm getting cynical as well as the country getting more cynical, the kind of there isn't necessarily a huge amount of positivity going on in some of the commissioning around culture, and it should be the most positive thing that they do, really.
A question about some consultancy that you might be having. Are they not actually commissioning research into non-commercial public-private spaces? Because it feels like the tension is constantly that if you're in a public space, you either have to be purchasing something or on your way to purchasing something. But are you aware of any cities that are deliberately creating a space that is non-commercial?
Well, lots of cities are trying to design parks.
Yeah, like more of in an urban environment that's not just like a green space, if that makes sense.
Can't think of any.
No. I don't know if they would do that explicitly anyway, would they?
No.
They'd just put different zoning on it.
Because that's the thing with, if you go to Leeds, pretty much as soon as you come out of the train station, you're in a mall, but you don't know that. You sort of get lost in this labyrinth of commercial space that feels that it should be public, but isn't. And I don't know if there's any kickback that people are saying we need to actually provide a safe space that's not for spending money, and there's like an actual plan to do that. If there isn't any reasons.
You could start a new party. I'd sign it up.
Yeah. I think there are often lots of agendas, there has to be a strategic rationale for investment, however small that investment is. So, to get a decision, to get politicians to make a decision about how public money is spent, there will be some kind of instrumental outcome, whether that's about increasing mobility, reducing crime, increasing footfall towards shopping, whatever it may be. There's always some sort of strategic driver for it, rather than pleasure or fairness or something.
We have a really great grassroots artistic community here, and we are constantly being asked, what do we want? And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what do you think Sheffield needs?
I can't say what it needs. I haven't been back for like 15 years.
You said to me it wasn't very legible earlier on.
No, it wasn't. No, it's not very legible at all. They seem to have removed the legibility. Yeah.
Can I just ask what legibility in that sense means?
I got off the train station. I didn't know where to go. You know, I mean, I haven't been here for 15 years, but I lived here for a long time. It was my, well, I lived on a farm outside, but you know, it was my city. I knew it. I got off. I couldn't. You just can't see through anymore. I mean, as I walked around this afternoon, I was like having memories, like, oh, that bit and that bit, but still, it just didn't. Really hard to navigate.
Better signage.
Better sign.
More legibility.
More legibility, yeah.
I'm a little bit closer to the city, obviously, because my role here. We are actually currently undertaking a piece of work for the City Council, which is looking at the cultural assets of the city, and to essentially try to work out what the city has and what it might be entitled to have for a city of this size, and how to get towards fulfilling potential, however that's defined. And there is this lovely tension at the heart of this conversation always around how you continue to provide the enabling conditions for this incredible independent sector or scene that sort of blossomed and actually keeps reinventing itself and repositioning itself in different parts of the city, on the one hand, and on the other hand, do those things that enhance the kind of cultural capital of the city in terms of its infrastructure. So its museums, its galleries, the central library, its festival economy, all that sort of thing. And there is this lovely tension at the heart of the conversation always around how you can have it both ways. I don't know what the answer is because it's still underway, but I think that the answer is not obviously to do things that in any way damage the kind of what is still quite a fragile ecosystem for lots of independent types of practice. That there is a need to celebrate and support, but to do so in a way that doesn't amplify and grow it beyond that which is perhaps it wants to grow, or you know, and there's all sorts of questions around sustainability, just as you know, the whole mansions of the future question is that do you nurture this scene to become next generation's formal culture kind of thing, which is probably not what you'd want to happen. But I think there are some massive gaps in the city's cultural infrastructure offer on a functional level and in terms of things that make it somewhere you're more likely to attract investment, visit or grow businesses in, and then that's when you get in all this stuff around what's culture for. But clearly Graves has got an incredible collection that is tucked away at the top of a building that's far from legible or accessible. You know, so there are some big questions around that sort of thing. There's a central library underneath it, and then there's all sorts of questions around what a library can be. And a library can be an amazing public space. So, this is part of the conversation that we're having at the moment as well around redefine the role of a library as a public utility in a changing city. So all of that's happening at the same time as thinking around, well, how do we just keep Sheffield attractive to the talent that has chosen to come here or to stay here? Don't know. Loads over there.
I was just wondering, when you're carrying out like envisioning a project, do you kind of see it as part of a bigger utopic vision? And if so, what do you think that utopia should be? And if not, why? If that makes sense.
I used to think quite a lot about utopia, and now I feel like you can make strategic moves and you don't know what the impact of that is going to be, but I don't have a notion. I see utopia in the way that people are with each other. That's what I want when I sometimes see a room full of people that you just wouldn't have come together other than through the activities or the project that's enabled that, and it suggests a different kind of society to me that's utopia.
God. I think the word process is really important. So whether it's about a bit of public space or a city, it has to keep changing, and changing in ways that obviously become hopefully more inclusive and fair and you know, better air, more opportunities, all that sort of stuff. There was sounds a bit frivolous. I was reading some research by Mintel the other day, you know, who do a lot of trend research internationally, and they were talking about the products that have never innovated, ever, pretty much. And in a supermarket, there's the aisle in the supermarket which has got all the stuff. There's all the cake mix and stuff, and then you've got tinned fruit, and there's tinned peaches and tinned plums and God knows what else. And they said that product hasn't changed since that product existed. And everyone knows what it is, but it's never changed. And in a sense, that there's a kind of that's what lots of cities end up defaulting to, because they feel this is what our identity is, this is what we're known for. People still buy us somehow, but actually they've stuck and they've never innovated or changed. And I just think that you've got to have something that feels like it's a process and it's changing all the time and it's aware of the need to change.